The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. The weight of his bearskin hat pressed down on his forehead, but he stood perfectly still, his expression as unchanging as the stone lions that guarded the palace gates. For 3 years James had served in the Queen's Guard, and in all that time he had never once broken protocol. The tourists were already gathering, their cameras clicking away as they tried to capture the perfect shot of the motionless sentries. Children pressed their faces against the iron railings, hoping to catch even the slightest movement from the red-coated figures. James had grown accustomed to the attention, the whispered comments, and the occasional attempt by visitors to make him smile or react. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different. The palace staff seemed more hurried than usual, and there had been whispered conversations among the senior officers during the morning briefing. James caught fragments of words about important visitors and diplomatic protocols, but his focus remained on his duty. The Queen's Guard was more than just a ceremonial position. These soldiers were highly trained members of the British Army, selected for their discipline, skill, and unwavering dedication to duty. Each guard underwent months of rigorous training, learning not just the precise movements and ceremonies, but also the deep history and significance of their role in protecting the monarch. James came from a military family. His grandfather had served in World War II, and his father had been a sergeant in the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers. From a young age, James knew he wanted to serve his country, and being selected for the Queen's Guard was the pinnacle of his military aspirations. The honor of protecting the sovereign was something he carried with immense pride. As the morning progressed, James noticed an unusual amount of activity near the main gates. Black cars with diplomatic plates were arriving, and men in expensive suits were being escorted into the palace grounds. The security presence had also increased, with additional police officers positioned at various points around the perimeter. The other guards maintained their positions with the same unwavering dedication as James. Guardsman Thompson stood at the adjacent post, his eyes fixed straight ahead, while guardsman Defies patrolled his designated route with mechanical precision. They were like pieces of a well-oiled machine, each playing their part in the greater ceremony of royal protection. The training James had received was both physical and mental. Guards learned to stand motionless for hours, regardless of weather conditions or distractions. They were taught to ignore provocations from tourists, to remain focused even when people tried to startle them, and to maintain their composure in any situation. The mental discipline required was as demanding as any physical challenge, but today would test James in ways his training had never anticipated. As the clock tower chimed 11, a convoy of military vehicles approached the palace gates. Unlike the diplomatic cars from earlier, these vehicles bore the flags and insignia of a foreign nation. The lead vehicle was an imposing black SUV, followed by 2 smaller escort cars. James watched from the corner of his eye as the vehicles came to a stop. Several men in military uniforms stepped out, their decorations and medals catching the sunlight. At the center of this group was a tall man with silver hair and a chest full of ribbons and honors. Even from a distance, James could tell this was someone of considerable importance and authority. The foreign delegation was met by palace officials and began walking toward the main entrance. As they approached, James could hear their conversation, though much of it was in a language he didn't recognize. The tall man seemed to be giving orders to his subordinates, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Little did James know that this encounter would soon challenge everything he had been trained to believe about duty, respect, and the unwavering principles that governed his service to the crown. General Viktor Petrov was not accustomed to being ignored. In his home country of Moldavia, when he walked into a room, every soldier snapped to attention. When he passed by military installations, guards presented arms and saluted with crisp precision. For 40 years he had climbed the ranks of his nation's military, and respect was something he expected as naturally as breathing. The general had arrived in London as part of a diplomatic mission that was, in reality, far more complex than it appeared. Moldavia was seeking military cooperation agreements with Britain, and Petrov had been sent to negotiate terms that would benefit his country's struggling economy. Behind his decorated exterior, however, was a man known for his volatile temper and his intolerance for what he perceived as disrespect. As the delegation approached the palace entrance, Petrov's eyes fixed on the motionless figure of James Mitchell. The young guard stood at perfect attention, his rifle held at the precise angle required by regulations, his gaze directed straight ahead. To most observers, this was exactly what they expected to see from a member of the Queen's Guard. But to General Petrov, this was an insult. In Moldavian military tradition, when a senior officer approached, junior personnel were expected to acknowledge their presence with an immediate salute. The fact that this British soldier remained motionless, seemingly oblivious to the presence of a general officer, struck Petrov as a deliberate slight. The palace liaison officer, Mr. Edmund Hartwell, was explaining the day's schedule as they walked, pointing out various architectural features and sharing brief historical anecdotes. He was an experienced diplomat who had handled countless foreign delegations, always ensuring that cultural differences were smoothly navigated. But he was unaware of the storm brewing in the general's mind. "Tell me," Petrov interrupted, his accent thick but his English clear, "why does that soldier not salute?" Hartwell looked puzzled for a moment, following the general's gaze to James. "Oh, the Queen's Guard? Sir, they maintain their ceremonial positions. It's part of their duty to remain motionless during their watch." "Motionless?" Petrov's voice carried a dangerous edge. "I am a general officer. In any civilized military, that soldier would show proper respect." The other members of the Moldavian delegation exchanged glances. They knew their commander's reputation, and they could sense the building tension. Colonel Vasquez, Petrov's aide-de-camp, stepped closer, ready to intervene if necessary. Hartwell maintained his diplomatic composure, though he was beginning to sense the potential for an incident. "General, I assure you no disrespect is intended. The Queen's Guard follows very specific protocols that have been in place for centuries. Their duty is to maintain their ceremonial watch." But Petrov was no longer listening to explanations. His pride had been wounded, and in his mind this was about more than military courtesy. This was about the respect that should be shown to his rank, his country, and his authority. He had not traveled thousands of miles to be ignored by a mere guardsman. The general's military career had been built on discipline and hierarchy. He had served in 3 different conflicts, commanded thousands of soldiers, and had never encountered a situation where his rank was not immediately acknowledged. The cultural nuances of British ceremonial duties were lost on him. All he saw was a soldier who was failing to show proper military courtesy. As they drew closer to James's position, Petrov made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. He stopped walking and turned to face the motionless guard directly. The rest of the delegation was forced to halt as well, creating an awkward pause in what had been a smooth diplomatic procession. "I will not be disrespected," Petrov announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. Several tourists turned to look, sensing that something unusual was happening. Hartwell felt his stomach drop. In his 20 years of diplomatic service, he had developed an instinct for when situations were about to spiral out of control. This was one of those moments. "General, perhaps we could continue with the scheduled tour, and I can explain the traditions later in more detail." But Petrov had already taken several steps toward James, his jaw set with determination. The young guardsman, trained to maintain his position regardless of distractions, continued to stare straight ahead. He was aware of the approaching figure in his peripheral vision, but his training demanded that he remain focused on his duty. The general stopped directly in front of James, close enough that the guard could hear his breathing. For a moment the courtyard fell silent except for the distant sounds of London traffic and the clicking of tourist cameras. Even the other palace visitors seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. "Soldier," Petrov said, his voice low but commanding, "you will salute me immediately." James Mitchell had faced many challenges during his time as a Queen's Guard, but none quite like this. The foreign officer's demand hung in the air like a thunderclap, and James could feel the eyes of dozens of onlookers upon him. His training had prepared him for tourists trying to distract him, for photographers attempting to provoke a reaction, even for protesters shouting at him. But this was different. The general's presence was imposing, and James could smell the man's cologne mixed with the scent of leather from his military boots. Every instinct told him to acknowledge the senior officer, but his duty to the crown was absolute. The Queen's Guard regulations were crystal clear. maintain position, remain motionless, and execute duties according to established protocol. Behind his stoic exterior, James's mind raced through his training. Sergeant Major Harrison's voice echoed in his memory from those first weeks at the Guards Depot. Your duty is to the sovereign and to the traditions of this regiment. Nothing, and I mean nothing, supersedes that duty. Not weather, not tourists, not foreign dignitaries, not even other military officers. The silence stretched on, becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone present except James, who had been trained to endure far longer periods of absolute stillness. General Petrov's face began to redden, and the tension in his posture was visible to anyone watching. Hartwell stepped forward cautiously, his diplomatic training kicking in as he attempted to defuse the situation. General Petrov, if I may explain the specific nature of the Queen's Guard's duties. I did not ask for explanations, Petrov snapped, his eyes never leaving James. I gave a direct order to a soldier. In any proper military, that order would be obeyed immediately. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Camera phones were raised and whispered conversations spread through the gathered onlookers. Some recognized that this was not part of the usual ceremonial display, while others simply found the confrontation entertaining. Colonel Vasquez, Petrov's aide, moved closer to his superior. As a career military officer himself, he understood the delicate nature of international diplomatic relations. General, he said quietly in their native language, perhaps we should consider the cultural differences here. But Petrov was beyond reason. In his mind, this had become a test of wills, a question of whether his authority would be respected on foreign soil. He had not risen to the rank of general by backing down from confrontations, and he was not about to start now. Soldier, Petrov repeated, his voice rising slightly. I am a general officer of the Moldavian Armed Forces. You will show proper military courtesy and salute immediately. James remained perfectly still. His breathing was controlled, his posture unchanged, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon beyond the palace gates. To an outside observer, he might have appeared to be a statue rather than a living person. The irony of the situation was not lost on those who understood military protocol. James was, in fact, showing the highest form of military courtesy by maintaining his duty. The Queen's Guard's unwavering dedication to their post was legendary throughout the military world. Foreign officers who understood British traditions typically viewed the Guards with deep respect for their discipline and commitment. But General Petrov saw only defiance. Hartwell made another attempt at intervention. General, the Guardsman is actually demonstrating the highest level of military discipline by maintaining his post. In the British system, this is considered the ultimate show of respect for duty and enough. Petrov's shout echoed across the courtyard, causing several tourists to step back in alarm. I have been patient enough. This soldier will acknowledge my rank or there will be consequences. The threat in his voice was unmistakable, and now even the tourists began to realize that this situation had moved beyond simple cultural misunderstanding into something potentially dangerous. Some began to back away, while others moved closer, their phones recording every moment. Palace security officers, who had been monitoring the situation from a discreet distance, began to move closer. They were trained to handle various types of incidents, but international diplomatic confrontations required careful handling. One wrong move could create an incident that would make headlines around the world. James could sense the growing tension around him, but his focus remained absolute. He had sworn an oath to serve the crown faithfully, and that oath meant more to him than any personal discomfort or potential consequences. His father had taught him about duty and honor, and his training had reinforced those values with military precision. The standoff continued, with neither man willing to back down. General Petrov, accustomed to immediate obedience, faced the immovable object of British military tradition embodied in James Mitchell. The young guardsman, trained to withstand any pressure while maintaining his duty, stood firm against an increasingly volatile foreign officer who viewed his steadfastness as a personal insult. The confrontation had reached a boiling point when General Petrov made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Frustrated by what he perceived as blatant disrespect, he reached out and placed his hand firmly on James Mitchell's shoulder, attempting to physically turn the guard to face him. The moment Petrov's hand made contact with the guardsman's uniform, everything changed. James had been trained for exactly this scenario. Physical interference with a Queen's Guard was strictly prohibited, and guards were authorized to respond appropriately to any such contact. Without breaking his forward gaze, James executed a precise movement, stepping back and bringing his rifle to a defensive position while maintaining perfect military bearing. "Sir, you are not permitted to touch the Queen's Guard," James stated in a clear, authoritative voice that carried across the courtyard. It was the first time he had spoken since taking his post that morning, and his words cut through the tension like a blade. The crowd of onlookers gasped audibly. Many had never heard a Queen's Guard speak while on duty, and the gravity of the situation was now unmistakable. Cameras clicked rapidly as tourists captured what they recognized as an unprecedented moment. General Petrov stepped back, more from surprise than respect. In all his years of military service, he had never been addressed in such a manner by a subordinate. His face flushed deep red, and his hand instinctively moved toward his ceremonial sidearm, though he caught himself before completing the gesture. "How dare you speak to me in that tone?" Petrov roared, his diplomatic composure completely abandoned. "I am a general officer." "You are nothing but a ceremonial decoration." But James had already returned to his motionless state, his brief response having served its purpose. He had made it clear that interference would not be tolerated, and now he resumed his duty as if nothing had happened. His training had prepared him for this exact sequence of events, and he had executed it flawlessly. Hartwell was now in full crisis management mode. He quickly positioned himself between the general and the guardsman, while gesturing frantically for palace security to intervene. "General Petrov, I must insist that we continue with the scheduled tour. This situation requires immediate de-escalation." But the damage was already done. News of the confrontation was spreading rapidly through social media, as tourists posted videos and photos online. Within minutes, hashtags were trending and news outlets were picking up the story. The diplomatic mission that was supposed to strengthen relations between Britain and Moldavia was rapidly becoming an international incident. Colonel Vasquez grabbed his superior's arm, speaking urgently in their native language. "General, we must leave immediately. This has gone too far, and there will be serious consequences if we don't withdraw now." The palace security team, led by Chief Inspector Reynolds, approached with professional calm but obvious authority. Reynolds had handled diplomatic incidents before, but this situation required delicate handling due to the international implications. "Gentlemen," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing crises, "I'm going to have to ask the delegation to step back from the guard post immediately." Petrov turned his fury toward the inspector. "This soldier has insulted me and my country. He refused a direct order from a general officer. This is an international incident." Reynolds remained calm, his years of experience serving him well. "Sir," the guardsman was performing his duty exactly as required by British military regulations. "Any interference with the Queen's Guard is strictly prohibited, regardless of the rank or nationality of the person involved." The truth was beginning to dawn on General Petrov that he had made a serious miscalculation. The tourists around him were recording everything, palace officials were treating him as the aggressor, and his own aide was pulling him away from the scene. What he had intended as a demonstration of authority was rapidly becoming a humiliating retreat. Hartwell seized the moment to guide the delegation away from the guard post. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter privately inside the palace. I'm sure we can reach an understanding about the cultural differences in our respective military traditions." But Petrov was beyond rational discussion. His pride had been wounded in the most public way possible, and he could see in the faces of the onlookers that they viewed him as the villain in this confrontation. The young British soldier had remained dignified and professional throughout, while he had lost his temper and made threats. As the delegation was escorted away from the courtyard, James Mitchell remained at his post as motionless as ever. To anyone arriving at the palace at that moment, there would be no indication that anything unusual had occurred. The guardsman stood at perfect attention, his rifle at the proper angle, his gaze fixed steadily ahead. But the ripple effects of the confrontation were just beginning to spread, and General Petrov was about to learn that challenging the traditions of the Queen's Guard had consequences that extended far beyond the palace gates. Within 2 hours of the confrontation, the story had exploded across international media. The video footage captured by tourists showed General Petrov's aggressive behavior contrasted sharply with James Mitchell's professional composure. News outlets around the world picked up the story, and the headlines were universally unfavorable to the Moldavian general. "Foreign general humiliated by Queen's Guard's unwavering duty," read the BBC headline. CNN ran with "Diplomatic incident at Buckingham Palace as general demands salute." Even international outlets that typically showed little interest in British ceremonial matters covered the story extensively, recognizing the broader implications of the incident. In the palace's diplomatic wing, emergency meetings were being convened. Ambassador Patricia Whitmore, Britain's chief diplomatic liaison, was briefing her staff on the developing crisis. The video footage had been viewed millions of times within hours, and the British Foreign Office was fielding calls from news outlets and diplomatic missions around the world. "The immediate concern," Ambassador Whitmore explained to her team, "is managing the diplomatic fallout while protecting our military traditions. The guardsmen acted with complete propriety, but we need to ensure this doesn't escalate into a broader international incident." Meanwhile, in a private conference room, General Petrov was facing the harsh reality of his actions. His phone had been ringing constantly with calls from his superiors in Moldavia, none of them pleased with the international attention their military delegation was receiving. The Moldavian defense minister had already issued a statement distancing the government from Petrov's behavior. Colonel Vasquez sat across from his superior, choosing his words carefully. "General, the Minister of Defense has requested that you issue a public apology. The President's office is concerned about the impact on our trade negotiations with Britain." Petrov's jaw tightened. The idea of apologizing to a subordinate soldier was anathema to everything he had been taught about military hierarchy. But the political reality was becoming impossible to ignore. Moldavia's economy desperately needed the trade agreements they had come to negotiate, and his behavior had jeopardized those discussions. "Show me the videos," Petrov said grimly. As he watched the footage on Vasquez's tablet, Petrov began to see the incident from the perspective of the watching world. The contrast was stark and damaging. The young British guardsman appeared calm, professional, and dignified throughout the encounter. He himself looked increasingly agitated, angry, and ultimately foolish as he demanded recognition that was never going to come. The most damaging footage showed the moment when Petrov had reached out to grab James's shoulder. In the video, it was clear that the general was the aggressor, while the guardsman's response was measured and appropriate. When James had spoken, his single warning about not touching the Queen's Guard, his voice was calm and authoritative, making Petrov's subsequent shouting appear even more inappropriate. Back at his post, James Mitchell continued his duty, though he was aware that something significant had occurred. Word had spread quickly through the palace staff, and he could sense a different energy in the air. Fellow guardsmen at other posts maintained their stoic demeanor, but there was an underlying sense of pride in their ranks. One of their own had upheld the highest traditions of their service under extraordinary pressure. Sergeant Major Harrison, the training officer who had drilled discipline into James during his early days with the Guards, arrived at the palace to personally check on his former trainee. Though protocol prevented him from speaking to James while on duty, Harrison's presence was a signal of support from the regiment's leadership. The social media response was overwhelmingly supportive of James and critical of Petrov. British citizens expressed pride in their guardsman's behavior, while military personnel from around the world praised his professionalism. Even some Moldavian citizens posted comments criticizing their general's conduct and expressing embarrassment about his behavior. Military experts who were interviewed by news outlets used the incident to explain the deep traditions and significance of the Queen's Guard. Colonel retired Michael Brennan, a former Guards officer, appeared on Sky News to provide context. What the public witnessed today was the embodiment of everything the Queen's Guard represents. That young soldier demonstrated that some duties are sacred and cannot be compromised, regardless of external pressure. The incident also sparked broader discussions about military tradition, diplomatic protocol, and cultural understanding. Military historians pointed out that the Queen's Guard's unwavering dedication to duty had been tested throughout centuries. of service, and they had never failed to maintain their standards. As evening approached, the political pressure on General Petrov had become overwhelming. The Moldavian embassy in London was dealing with a crisis that threatened to derail years of careful diplomatic work. The trade mission that had brought Petrov to Britain was now in serious jeopardy, and his government was demanding immediate damage control. The irony was not lost on military observers that Petrov's demand for respect had resulted in the complete opposite outcome. Instead of receiving the recognition he felt he deserved, he had become an international symbol of how not to conduct oneself in diplomatic situations. The young guardsman he had tried to humiliate had become a hero, while Petrov faced the possibility of ending his military career in disgrace. The following morning brought devastating news for General Petrov. The Moldavian president had personally called the British Prime Minister to apologize for the incident and announced that Petrov was being immediately recalled to face a military tribunal. The trade negotiations would continue, but under new leadership, and Petrov would play no part in them. The general sat in his hotel room, still in disbelief at how quickly his career had unraveled. 40 years of military service, countless commendations, and a reputation built through decades of dedicated work had been destroyed in a single moment of poor judgment. The international humiliation was complete, and there would be no recovering from it. Colonel Vasquez knocked softly on the door before entering. His face was grave as he delivered the final blow. "General, I have orders from the Defense Ministry. You are to return to Moldavia immediately on the next available flight. A formal investigation into your conduct will begin upon your arrival." Petrov nodded slowly, the fight finally gone out of him. "What about the delegation?" "Colonel Antonescu will assume command of the mission. The negotiations will proceed as scheduled, but without your participation." Vasquez paused, then added more softly, "Sir, for what it's worth, I believe your intentions were never malicious." "But the execution was catastrophic," Petrov finished. "I know." Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell was completing what would become one of the most famous guard shifts in the regiment's history. As his replacement arrived for the change of guard ceremony, James finally allowed himself to relax slightly. The precision drill of the guard change proceeded flawlessly, a testament to the unbreakable traditions that he had defended so courageously. Word of his steadfast duty had reached the highest levels of the British military and government. The colonel of the regiment had personally commended James's conduct, and there was talk of formal recognition for his exemplary service under pressure. More importantly to James, he had earned the deep respect of his fellow guardsmen and the gratitude of a nation that took pride in its military traditions. The international media coverage continued throughout the day, with military experts using the incident to highlight the importance of cultural understanding in diplomatic relations. Several former British military officers appeared on television to explain the deep significance of the Queen's Guard's duty and why James's response had been not only appropriate, but necessary. Dr. Margaret Thornton, a professor of international relations at Oxford, provided perhaps the most insightful analysis during a BBC interview. What we witnessed was a perfect example of how cultural misunderstanding can escalate into serious diplomatic incidents. The general expected personal recognition, but the guardsman's duty was to something far greater than any individual, regardless of rank. The incident also prompted discussions within military academies around the world about the importance of understanding foreign military traditions when operating in international environments. The footage of the confrontation became a teaching tool, demonstrating how quickly a misunderstanding could spiral into a crisis. For the British public, James Mitchell had become an overnight hero. His calm professionalism in the face of aggressive pressure embodied the best qualities they expected from their military. Flowers and letters of support began arriving at the palace, addressed simply to the Queen's Guard who stood his ground. The contrast between the two central figures could not have been starker. James had followed his training and duty perfectly, never wavering from his obligations despite unprecedented pressure. His response had been measured, appropriate, and effective. Petrov, on the other hand, had allowed his ego and cultural misunderstanding to override his diplomatic mission, resulting in personal and professional disaster. As evening fell over London, the ripple effects of the confrontation continued to spread. Military attachés at embassies around the world were receiving briefings about the incident and its implications for future diplomatic missions. The unwritten rule had been reinforced. Respect for local military traditions was not optional in international relations. General Petrov spent his final evening in London writing a letter of resignation from his military commission. He had decided that rather than face the humiliation of a tribunal, he would end his career on his own terms. The young British guardsman had taught him a lesson about duty that he would never forget, though it had come at the cost of everything he had worked to achieve. The story would be retold for years to come in military circles, serving as both a celebration of unwavering duty and a cautionary tale about the importance of understanding and respecting the traditions of allied nations. James Mitchell's name would be remembered alongside the greatest examples of steadfast service in the Queen's Guard's illustrious history. 6 months later, the incident at Buckingham Palace had become a defining moment in both men's lives, though their paths had diverged dramatically. James Mitchell stood once again at his post, but now wore the stripes of a lance corporal, having been promoted in recognition of his exemplary conduct. The story of his unwavering duty had become legend within the Guards regiments, and new recruits learned about his example during their training. The young soldier had handled his sudden fame with the same dignity he had shown during the confrontation. He declined most interview requests, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. When he did speak publicly, it was always to emphasize that he had simply done his duty as any guardsman would have done. General Viktor Petrov had returned to Moldavia to face the consequences of his actions. True to his decision, he had submitted his resignation before the tribunal could convene, ending a military career that had once seemed destined for the highest honors. The man who had demanded respect from a foreign soldier now found himself stripped of the rank and recognition he had spent decades earning. The former general had taken a position with a private security firm, a job that paid well but carried none of the prestige or authority he had once commanded. His colleagues treated him professionally, but he could see in their eyes the knowledge of his public failure. The video of his confrontation with the Queen's Guard had become a case study in military academies, ensuring that his humiliation would be remembered for generations. In quiet moments, Petrov reflected on the lessons he had learned too late. He had come to understand that the young British soldier had shown him more respect than he had initially realized. James's unwavering commitment to duty, even in the face of pressure from a senior foreign officer, demonstrated the highest form of military honor. The guardsman had been protecting something greater than himself, while Petrov had been protecting only his ego. The diplomatic mission to Britain had ultimately succeeded, but under different leadership. The trade agreements that Moldavia desperately needed were signed 3 months after the incident, with Colonel Antonescu receiving credit for salvaging the negotiations. The new Moldavian leadership made a point of visiting Buckingham Palace during their stay, where they observed the changing of the Guard with appropriate respect and admiration. James Mitchell's story had inspired military personnel around the world. The video of his calm response to General Petrov's aggression was shown in military academies as an example of proper conduct under pressure. His ability to maintain his composure while clearly communicating boundaries had become a textbook example of professional military behavior. The incident had also prompted changes in diplomatic protocol. Embassy staff members now received more comprehensive briefings about local military traditions before hosting foreign delegations. The importance of cultural understanding in international relations had been reinforced in the most public way possible. For the Queen's Guard as an institution, the incident had served to highlight the significance of their role beyond mere ceremony. The public had gained a deeper appreciation for the dedication and professionalism required of these soldiers, understanding that they were not simply tourist attractions but highly trained military personnel with serious responsibilities. The palace had quietly implemented new procedures for handling foreign military delegations, ensuring that visitors received clear briefings about the protocol surrounding the Queen's Guard. The goal was to prevent future misunderstandings while maintaining the integrity of centuries-old traditions. James continued to serve with distinction, his experience having deepened his appreciation for the role he played in British military tradition. He had learned that duty sometimes required standing firm against overwhelming pressure, and that doing the right thing often came with personal cost. In his case, however, the cost had been far outweighed by the respect he had earned from his peers and his country. The story became part of the oral tradition passed down through generations of guardsmen. New recruits learned about Lance Corporal Mitchell's example as they underwent their own training, understanding that they were joining a tradition that demanded unwavering commitment to duty above all else. As for General Petrov, he eventually found a measure of peace in his new life, though the lessons of that day at Buckingham Palace remained with him always. He had learned that true respect could not be demanded, but must be earned through consistent demonstration of honor and integrity. The young British soldier had taught him more about leadership in one brief encounter than 40 years of military service had done. The incident served as a lasting reminder that in the modern world, cultural understanding and mutual respect were essential components of successful international relations. One moment of poor judgment could undo years of careful diplomacy, while steadfast adherence to principle could inspire respect across all boundaries of rank and nationality.